Hello, everybody, and welcome to our podcast, Unpacking Organizations, where Rupert and I talk about our passion topics. Rupert, how are you doing today?
Doing great, thanks.
How
We're
was your
getting
spring break?
we're into spring.
I know.
Ish. The sun comes out and then it pours some more. There's in Britain. There's been record rain for the last few months.
Oh,
Everything's absolutely like flooded everywhere. It's like unbelievable. So
I didn't know that.
um,
Well, there is a lot of
anyway,
sunshine in New Jersey, thankfully.
there's
So
always more sunshine in the US than there is in Britain. That's for sure.
I'll send over the pond.
Unpacking Organizations, the Practitioners Podcast. Sponsored by Orgvue.
So, time of the year where things are changing and we have new seasons, I thought maybe today is a good day to talk about explainer, right? The explainers that we have is that let's take a topic, let's dissect it, and say that, okay, how do we actually think about it? And from that perspective, I feel that there is a concept around time and how do we think about time as we do org design as we do workforce planning. And not many time it's clear very much, right? Because org design is as is to be, workforce planning is more continuous. But let's can should we touch upon that today? Like, how do we think about these different constructs over different time horizons, and how should we actually be unpacking that as we do org design work within the org, within our topics?
Great. Let's go.
Okay. So, Rupert, how do you think about, like in your book, you've written about time horizons, which are like, timestamps and more continuous, but there is more to it. There is like, strategic, there is operational. How do you think about all of that? Let's start there first.
Great. So I love the rule of three. People can remember threes, they can't remember four. So that's why so many acronyms are TLAs, which are three-letter acronyms. Um, so here we go. Here's another TLA, which is SOT, and that spells strategic, operational, tactical. And when we talk about, say, workforce planning, you talk about strategic workforce planning, and we talk about operational workforce planning, tactical workforce planning. So, what is the difference? And it's a lot of it is time horizon, and it's also a level of granularity. So, the time horizon with strategic is multi-year. It's slightly industry specific. So, if you're, in the nuclear energy industry, you're talking, 20, 30 years is the time horizon. If you're in automotive and you're talking about moving to EV, it's really 10 years that you're looking into the future. A lot of the tech world, it's, maybe you can look as far as 5, 7 years into the future, but it's multi-year. And the workforce planning is therefore multi-year. So the level of aggregation, you're not doing it at the role level. So you do it what we call the role cluster. So you're aggregating different roles into the same cluster because and because it's too complicated to do it at the role level. So you do it at a high level of aggregation, further into the future, and the level of you might just have an annual plan rather than a monthly plan. So the series is more aggregated as well, and that's the strategic. Operational, I think, is really, if you think about budgeting, a budget is an operational plan. Time horizon 12 months, at most 18 months, typically 12 months. Level of granularity is monthly. And when you're doing your planning, you're really doing that at the role and position level. How many positions do we need at this point in time to achieve these objectives? And you're counting those up, and then people sit in positions. So operational, think 12 months and monthly. Tactical, it's really scheduling. You're managing the plant. What's the shift pattern? Oh my goodness, it's, there's the weather forecast is great. So we need to get some more temporary labor in, right? Because we're that our business is impacted by the weather, and so it's really tactical, reacting to what's happening on the ground, and that's really done sort of an hourly level, is done at the person, the individual human level. Um, and so the mindset, the thinking is quite different with the tactical, operational, and strategic. And
Would you
obviously yeah.
also, sorry, would you also consider like capacity planning and tactical? Because sometimes that also gets like, lost in this whole mix, that how do we actually plan for capacity? It's more dependent on industry again. Not every industry needs it, but where it is needed, where would you put that?
I've so the term capacity planning, um, I've used and had seen used a lot in both all three contexts. So I built a capacity planning model back in 2002 for a government agency that went out, beyond 5 years. And it was dealing with changes in technology and legislation and shifting work around. So that was a strategic and operational model. It was called a capacity planning model, and demand and supply both. What's the demand? What's the supply? And how do we map that and match demand and supply? So I think the term capacity planning, I don't hear it as much anymore. So I kind of feel like it's been superseded with the term workforce planning. Um, but I don't just see capacity planning as a tactical thing. Although clearly you have capacity planning, you've got to fill shifts, and particularly where you've got huge variation in day to day, week to week um, demand. Then that's relevant, and that's where temporary labor and everything else and augmenting the workforce is particularly helpful. And then with org design, org design really takes two pictures. It's not common for people to say at what point in time is the two. So what is the to be? Just a to be is defined. So there's an as is and a to be, and it's like the metaphor I like to use is it's just you're taking a photo. I'm taking a snapshot of today, which as soon as I take the snapshot, that is wrong, and I take a snapshot at some point in the future, but it's probably 3 to 6 months into the future, where because I have to go through the change, and in certain places it might be longer, and that might be phased. You can see it taking 2 years if it's post merger integration, and it's a huge change. Um, but there is a to be, and then there's about how do we go through the transition management to get from this as is to the to be. The techniques used for right sizing, we've done a podcast on right sizing, is exactly the same when you're trying to scale the organization. The FIDRAM metaphor that we talked about, and we should leave in the notes the right sizing episode where we talked about that. But so to me, when you're doing org design, you still use the same techniques as workforce planning, but it's just 2 points in time. Whereas with workforce planning, it's a continuous. Now, the continuous is with a caveat, and strategic if it's an annual workforce plan or quarterly. Obviously, the level of granularity, the number of photos taken in the movie isn't as great as that in say tactical, which is really hourly. I, I think where the confusion is people use the term strategic workforce planning, and more often than not, they're actually doing operational workforce planning. So they're applying this term strategic to what is an operational process in budgeting, because the term strategy is such a misused term anyway. um, and it's not really taking into account longer term drivers that fit within this. What are the changes, the new markets, new drivers, new technology, productivity. So things that have a strategic impact beyond just that operational planning process. And I think people get confused a lot because of that, which is why it's helpful to think of these three different time horizons and three very different sort of activities and functions and mindsets. The strategic workforce planning is really about looking at different scenarios and then different options of how we react to those scenarios, and sensitivity analysis, and all those kind of techniques. That applies really to the strategic realm, because you go so far into the future, you don't know what's going to happen. So, and this is where actually a scenario is something that happens to you, and an option is a choice you make. And I see people get confused with that as well. They will say, "Oh, what's what are our different scenarios?" As if they're options. No, scenario is there is GDP growth of X, and this party wins the election, and this is the legislation. So things that happen outside, externally, exogenous to you, and then your options of what would we do in each of those scenarios, and how could we optimize, and then how you can have a discussion on how likely is that scenario. But it's really around uncertainty, and strategic thinking is thinking that is uncertain thinking, right? You don't know what's going to happen. Whereas in your budget, you're actually creating a plan and say, this is what we're going to do. This is the budget. This is what we're committing to the board that we're going to achieve. That we need to execute the plan now. So what resources do we need at what point in time, and what geography, and what function, and what grade, etc. So and then you then execute on that, i.e. talent acquisition, fills the vacancies, etc., etc.
So another way I was thinking as you were talking, Rupert, is that one of the one of the levers to react to a strategic workforce planning scenario is also org design, because if we are going into new markets, then we may have to think about a new whole team, or if we are changing our product base or operating model in the next 5 years, then also, like, things like that, then also we'll have to think about org design. But in more of operational planning, the org design lever is difficult to pull through because it's just very reactionary. And I think
Yeah,
that is also something that we should keep in mind, that
yeah,
while it's important to think about org design and the changing dynamic nature of the organization, it is not a reaction caused due to operational planning.
yeah, yeah. I totally agree. I think org design. I mean, you might make micro changes around responsibilities and what have you, but org design really sits within multi. When you're doing the design, you're thinking about your strategy and what's needed longer term, and that's the two photographs as a metaphor, as is in 2B. And there's so much complexity there. That's why it's helpful just to simplify, say there's only 2 points in time. Whereas in workforce planning, particularly operational, you're getting close to the execution of things. So the level of granularity is greater, and the detail. And the part of the challenge is a lot of people have a mindset that is more comfortable in one of the three. Certain people are really good at scheduling and tactical, and you need all three types. But to have all three, it's like the thinking hats. We all have different natural places, and sometimes someone who's responsible for, say, scheduling or what have you, say, will do strategic workforce planning as well. That's totally not their wheelhouse. Like, and it's dealing with that level of ambiguity and um, uncertainty, and it's abstract thinking. It's very abstract in many respects, isn't it? Because you just don't know. So I think there's a pitfall of trying to have the certain people do all three.
That's
Um,
a great call out.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's my takeaway, Rupert, from this is that we try to do everything in single approach, or a single thinking line of thinking um, through one team itself, involving the same set of people, and that is not going to yield the results that we want to, because strategic workforce planning requires us to involve more senior stakeholders who can think through abstract thinking and think about the scenarios that are important for the organization 5 years down the road, while tactically you need some other folks and sets and skill sets in order to do that. So I think that is my takeaway from it, that don't try to use the same tools to do all the three planning
yeah,
in the organization.
but it's also if you're the leader and you're doing operational budgeting, know that's what you're doing. And then when you're doing, strategic work, know that it's different. Like, understand. So I like the Disney hat model where you got the three hats, and you got the dreamer, you got the operator, and you got the critic. And this Disney model, I think, is quite similar to this. The dreamer is dreaming, and when I've done workshops, I would give people physically different color hats, because you have the critic can't help but be the critic, and I'm like, well, we have to do the dreaming bit now, so put a green hat on and think like that. Then we go into operating. How would we make this happen? Put the blue hat on, and then when we be the critic, put the red hat on. Like, break it down, smash it, and all three thinking styles are critical. You need all three types, and the danger is when you exclude one or two. Now, if you have to be all three, it's just physically think, or even put a hat, like buy 3 color hats and just wear those, just to help you. And not everyone has the luxury to employ people in the different places. So, I think dose of pragmatism is probably needed as well. But just to say, okay, we're now doing strategic workforce planning, or we're doing OD. So this is the framing, this is the level. Okay, we're all clear on this. Now let's think about scenarios and then what are the best options. And just by asking the questions in that way, I think will help people. And and also, like, some junior people, they might be junior, but they can think in that way, because it's also it's a personal characteristic trait as well. I think some people are more comfortable with ambiguity than other people. It's not good or bad, it's just different.
Yeah, and have different people in the room, like
Yeah,
involve uh, different segments of people in the different departments.
different
I would
thinking
assume,
styles. Yeah,
right, and I
yeah,
would assume that more of finance may come into play when you're doing more of operation planning than anybody else. So have those friends come from that department
yeah,
join your meetings.
yeah.
Great. Rupert,
Cool.
what is your takeaway?
My takeaway is just clarity of language. It's a very common one. And clarity of, okay, we're discussing this, so giving context at the, okay, we're now going to work on this. This is the framing of it, which only needs to take 1 or 2 minutes, and that can avoid a whole bunch of confusion.
Great.
So yeah, there we go.
Thank you so much. Thank you,
Thank
Rupert.
you.
This is very interesting, and I'm sure our audience got some takeaways from them. Until next time,
Until next time. Thank you.
take care.
Unpacking Organizations, the Practitioners Podcast. Sponsored by Orgvue.